Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tim Barnett from Credas Technologies. Thank you for joining us for the very first in a series of webinars that we'll be conducting over the coming months. Each of the webinars will be very short, no longer than 15 minutes, because we do appreciate that everyone's very busy. The purpose really of Credas is to provide a technology service so that our customers can meet their compliance obligations, and those obligations are set out in legislation. The legislation is an ever-evolving and ever-changing feast. So it's not only important that our technology is constantly evolving to future-proof our customers against these changes, but that our customers know what those changes are in case they have wider ramifications for their business. That's what these webinars are all about, is to quickly update people on recent changes to legislation that may well impact your business. One such recent change was the right to rent legislation, which impacts all landlords and agents. To give you the details, what I'd like to do is hand over to our compliance manager here at Credas, Lewis Lancaster.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. So yeah, today just wanting to go through a few things about the recent right to rent changes. So on the agenda today, just looking at why right to rent is in place, who we have to do right to rent checks on, when the checks have to be done, how they can be done, so the ways to obtain a statutory excuse for the Home Office, and then also penalties for if you don't comply with that. So in terms of why, it all started with the legislation introduced by the government in 2014 with the Immigration Act. Effectively, this said that in order for someone to rent in the UK, they had to have like the evidence that they could remain in the UK. One of the punishments that they put into the Immigration Act 2014 was that those landlords or their letting agents that didn't comply with the legislation would be subject to a civil penalty. This was then updated in 2016 with the Immigration Act 2016, which then actually made it a criminal offence. So rather than just having that civil penalty, there's then also the criminal offence aspect, which means obviously if you rented to a disqualified person, you could be subject to criminal discrimination. But what's important to know is that although it's a UK legislation and although the Immigration Act applied to the entirety of the UK, actually right to rent only applies to England. Interestingly, although it's been around in England since 2014, they tried to move it into Wales and Scotland, but this was challenged by the courts, and then the court ultimately decided in 2019 that it breaches Human Rights Act because it's more likely to make landlords discriminate between British citizens and non-British citizens if they have to do these checks. So as it stands, it only applies in England. So if you do have any tenancies or if you have any properties over in Wales or Scotland or even Northern Ireland, it's obviously important to know that you don't have to do right to rent checks there. Although you will, of course, still want to make sure that you're identifying your tenants to ensure that you're putting the correct people in there and knowing if anything goes wrong, who it was that was in there. So ID checks still yes, but obviously you don't have to do right to rent checks in Wales, Northern Ireland or Scotland. In terms of who you have to perform those checks on, so it's any adult over the age of 18. So it's not just a case of the people that are on the tenancy. So if you do have a 40-year-old couple, they are going to be signing the tenancy. They're responsible for the rental payments. If, for example, they had a child that was 18, 19 who was going to be living there, you'd have to do the right to rent check on them as well. It wouldn't just be those two on the tenancy. It's important to know that you only have to do it if the property is going to be the only or the main home of the people living there, because there are exemptions to doing right to rent. So, for example, if it's holiday accommodation, obviously if people have Airbnbs, you don't have to do right to rent checks on guests for that. Likewise, even if you have tenants in a property and you know that for 2 weeks their mum's coming from overseas to stay in the property, they're considered guests, so you wouldn't have to do right to rent checks on them. And also if it's for a long lease, which the government defines as more than 7 years. So there are exemptions where you don't have to do right to rent checks, but you know, if primarily if it's any adult over the age of 18 and it's going to be their only or main home, then you will need to do those right to rent checks. In terms of when to perform them, so basically all the time it should be before the tenancy agreement is entered into. So that's before that tenancy agreement is signed. The Home Office does obviously acknowledge that there are times when that's not possible, such as if you've got either a student or an individual living overseas who's then going to be moving to England. it may not be possible to obviously do those checks prior to them arriving. So what they say there then is, okay, you can sign the tenancy agreement, but before they occupy the property, you then have to conduct those right to rent checks. So primarily before the agreement's entered into, but if necessary, it has to be done before occupation. In terms of how you can do these checks, there are 3 ways that the Home Office says that you can do them. So there's a manual check. This is where you actually have the physical document in your possession. Interestingly, the person doesn't have to be in front of you. They might have sent the original passport to you through recorded delivery, but you have to hold that physical document, that real genuine document, for the manual check. And then in terms of confirming that the person you're dealing with is the person within the document, you can then either do that in person or via a video call. The other one, which is new from the 6th of April this year, is the use of an identity service provider such as Credas. So where you're using an IDSP, as they're called, it's case you can do this on British and Irish citizens. And basically they've turned around and said that if you use an IDSP in the correct way, which I'll go on to shortly, then you'll have that statutory excuse from any penalties. And then the final option as well is the Home Office online service. So anytime that you're dealing with a non-UK or non-Irish citizen, they have to confirm their right to rent using the Home Office online service. So again, since the 6th of April this year, it's no longer acceptable to accept a biometric residence permit or a biometric or residence certificate. It has to be, whether they're from the EU or outside the EU, it has to be that they get that share code from the Home Office online service, and then you obtain the report from the Home Office. As I mentioned, so the Home Office has now accepted that technology can be used and has said that IDSPs can be used. So what they've done is the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has created something called the UK Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework, and the Home Office as well as the DBS have both signed up to that now and said, okay, well, as long as an IDSP is using that framework and is certified with that framework, they're happy for you to use an IDSP. They do have minimum requirements. They say that the IDSP has to validate the identity to a medium level of confidence. Here at Credas, we've been certified. We got our certification earlier on this year. We were one of the first, and we're certified for M1A. So those are the cases where you've got a passport, but perhaps they're doing it on a device that doesn't have NFC technology, or they're doing the check on their web browser. So again, they can't do NFC checks. So that would be your M1A, and that will work. And then M1C is those times when you've got that passport, it's got that electronic chip inside it, you're using your Apple or your Android phone, you can read the chip in the passport and authenticate it that way. So we're certified in both those identity profiles, both of which satisfy the Home Office requirements. And then also something else that IDSPs such as Credas can do is also assist with the Home Office online service. So as I say, it's a case of for those who those who aren't British or Irish citizens, you have to have that Home Office online service. Well, what we can do is when we send out that invitation on your behalf and someone uses a passport which isn't British or Irish, our technology detects that and says, right, we need to collect a share code from you. And then it asks the end user to input their share code. That then comes back to Credas. We obtain the report from the Home Office for you and then provide that to you, which means then, you know, you can deal with people that are UK and Irish citizens, but also those that are from overseas, all within the same ecosystem here at Credas. In terms of penalties, if you rent to those that are disqualified, it's a case of, as I said, from 2014 there was a civil penalty, and that's up to £3,000 per disqualified person. When I say up to £3,000, generally, if it's your first offence or, you know, it's only sort of marginally, for example, you did checks, but they weren't quite right, you know, the fine tends to be a bit like less, but it can be up to £3,000 per qualified person. So again, if you've got that situation where you've got the parents and then the child in the property as well who's over 18, that's 3 people. If you haven't done those checks, that's potentially £6,000 that you may have to pay. As I said, in 2016, they also introduced making it a criminal offence as well. So again, if you're found to be renting to a disqualified person, you can actually be in prison for up to 5 years. So it's really something to take seriously and make sure that you know what you're doing. And so the only way to avoid either of these penalties, the conviction or the monetary penalty, is to make sure you've got that statutory excuse I talked about. And you get that by doing what the Home Office says in terms of either the manual check, the check with an IDSP like Credas, or doing that Home Office online service. So it's really big penalties for if you don't do it correctly. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you are. Really, that's about it really in terms of the highlights with the changes that I wanted to make. Further information can always be found on the Home Office website. So you're really looking at the Landlord's Guide to Right to Rent, and even as letting agents, that's there for you as well. The Landlord's Code of Practice, as well as the Right to Rent documents checks, all of those really interesting documents, really informative documents, and will really sort of make sure that you've got those statutory excuses to avoid any penalties. That's it for me, so I will hand back to Tim.
Many thanks, Lewis. Appreciate that. Thanks for your time. Quite interesting actually to hear how right to rent checks and legislation is applied differently in different areas of the UK. I know that's not widely appreciated. Also to reiterate an important point that Lewis made, that if you do wish to conduct your right to rent checks remotely, the government does recommend that you use a certified providers. And there's not that many actually in the UK, less than a couple of dozen certified providers, and not all of those offer right to rent checks as well. If you're a Credas customer, you can relax knowing that Credas were one of the first to obtain our certification. If you're not currently a Credas customer but wish to try our service, speak to your sales representative at Credas or book a demo through our website, and we can set you up with a free trial. So you don't have to take our word for it. You can use our technology in the wild. We'll give you some free credits and you can try it out to see if that suits your requirements. Thank you very much for your time today. If you wish to sign up for future webinars, please do so via our website. And lastly, if you've got any queries at all actually regarding right to rent, ID verification, anti-money laundering checks, whether you're a Credas customer or not, our company values basically dictate that we'll help anyone with absolutely no obligation or commitment. So please feel free to get in touch via our website. We'll always be happy to help. Thank you very much.